The sun was setting over the city skyline, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. It had been another successful day at the downtown law office for the civil rights attorney. He'd just wrapped up a major workplace discrimination case, one that would help hundreds of employees get fair treatment at their jobs. The feeling of making real change, of helping people stand up for their rights, that's what kept him going through the long hours and challenging cases. As he drove his Tesla Model 3 through the peaceful suburban streets, his mind wandered to the family waiting for him at home. His daughter had a big soccer game tomorrow, and he promised to help her practice her penalty kicks before bedtime. The car's electric motor hummed quietly as he turned onto the familiar roads leading to his neighborhood, passing the same local shops and cafes he'd known for years. The attorney adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his tired but satisfied expression. His suit jacket lay neatly folded in the passenger seat, his tie loosened just a bit after the long day. The dashboard clock showed 6:45 p.m., still enough time for that soccer practice he'd promised. The recent case had been particularly meaningful, representing a group of warehouse workers who'd faced systematic discrimination in promotions and pay. Seeing their faces when the verdict came in, the hope and relief in their eyes, that's what made all the late nights worth it. He'd been practicing law for 15 years now, building a reputation as someone who fought for what was right, someone who stood up for people who couldn't always stand up for themselves. His office walls were lined with thank you letters from families he helped, each one a reminder of why he chose this path. Sure, he could have taken a cushy corporate job, but that wasn't what he was about. He was about making real change, one case at a time. The neighborhood was quiet tonight, with just a few people walking their dogs or jogging along the tree-lined streets. He waved to Mr. Johnson, the retired teacher who always tended to his garden at this hour. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. The kind of evening that made you appreciate the simple things in life, the gentle breeze coming through the cracked window, the familiar sights of home, the satisfaction of a job well done. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. She was making his favorite dinner to celebrate the case victory. He smiled, thinking about how she always knew just how to make even the small wins feel special. As he approached the intersection near his subdivision, he noticed how the streetlights were just starting to flicker on, creating pools of light on the darkening streets. The attorney reached over to adjust the air conditioning, his university law degree catching the last rays of sunlight as it hummed from the rearview mirror. 15 years of fighting for justice, and each day still brought new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. He thought about the young law students he mentored, always telling them that being a civil rights lawyer wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Just then, something in his rearview mirror caught his attention. The familiar flash of red and blue lights pierced through the peaceful evening. His heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from years of experience knowing what might come next. He'd been here before, both as a civilian and as a lawyer representing others in similar situations. With practiced calm, he began to slow down, signaling to pull over to the side of the road. Little did he know, this routine drive home was about to become anything but routine. As he pulled over, he reached for his phone, making sure his dashboard camera was recording. Years of legal experience had taught him to document everything. He took a deep breath, placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, and prepared himself for whatever was about to unfold. The police cruiser's lights painted everything in alternating flashes of red and blue, creating dancing shadows across the quiet suburban street. The civil rights attorney watched in his side mirror as the officer took his time getting out of the patrol car, making him wait. He'd seen this tactic before. A power play meant to build anxiety in the person being stopped. But after 15 years of handling civil rights cases, he knew exactly what to do. His dashboard camera was already running, its small red light a reassuring presence. The attorney kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, clearly visible through the back window. Through his side mirror, he could see neighbors slowing down their evening walks to watch the scene unfold. A young couple pushing a stroller across to the other side of the street, their curious glances mixing with concern. The officer's footsteps approached deliberately, boots crunching on the gravel at the road's edge. The attorney noticed how the officer's hand rested on his holster, an unnecessary gesture that he'd seen countless times in cases he handled. He took slow, steady breaths, mentally reviewing the proper procedures that should be followed during a traffic stop. His expertise wasn't just professional knowledge anymore, it was a shield. The tap on his window was louder than necessary, another small intimidation tactic. The attorney pressed the button to lower his window, the electric motor humming smoothly. The cool evening air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of the officer's leather gear and recently applied hand sanitizer. The police officer's flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, lingering just a bit too long on the attorney's face, then on his suit jacket in the passenger seat. "License and registration," the officer demanded, skipping any greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was clipped, authoritative, expecting immediate compliance. The beam of his flashlight remained steady, despite the car's interior light being clearly sufficient. The attorney had heard this exact tone hundreds of times before in his cases. It was always the same script. "Good evening, officer," the attorney replied calmly, his voice steady and professional. "May I respectfully ask why I'm being pulled over?" He kept his tone neutral, neither challenging nor submissive. This simple question, a basic right of any citizen, seemed to catch the officer off guard. The flashlight beam wavered slightly. More patrol cars were approaching now, their lights reflecting off nearby windows and creating a light show that was drawing even more attention. The attorney noticed his neighbors from 3 doors down had come onto their porch to watch. He could see them whispering to each other, phones in hand. The situation was escalating, but not because of anything he had done. The officer shifted his stance, adjusting his utility belt with his free hand. "I said, license and registration," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume would change the fact that he was legally required to provide a reason for the stop. The attorney could hear the crackle of a radio, more officers discussing something just out of earshot. This was a moment the attorney had prepared his clients for countless times, the crucial intersection of civil rights and law enforcement interaction. He thought about all the similar stories he'd heard in his office, all the cases he'd fought. But this time, he wasn't the lawyer taking notes across a desk. He was living it. His heart beat a little faster, but his mind remained clear. Years of courtroom experience had taught him to stay composed under pressure. He knew that what happened next would depend largely on how he handled these crucial moments. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a civil rights attorney, facing the very situation he'd helped so many others navigate. Through the windshield, he could see yet another patrol car pulling up, its lights adding to the growing display of police presence. It was a response level typically reserved for serious crimes, not routine traffic stops. The attorney's dashboard camera continued recording faithfully, documenting every second of what was quickly becoming an unnecessarily tense situation. Keeping his voice steady, he tried once more. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I have a right to know why I'm being stopped. I'm happy to provide my license and registration once you tell me the reason for this stop." He maintained eye contact through the rearview mirror, his hands never leaving the steering wheel. The next few moments would be crucial, and he knew it. The summer evening had grown unusually quiet, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Even the crickets seemed to have paused their evening chorus. The attorney could feel the weight of his law degree hanging from the rearview mirror, a silent witness to this unfolding scene. What happened next would either de-escalate the situation or turn this routine stop into something much more serious. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The officer's posture stiffened at the attorney's simple request to know why he'd been pulled over. Red and blue lights continued to paint the street in alternating colors, creating an almost surreal atmosphere in the previously peaceful neighborhood. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his hand still resting on his holster. The attorney's heart beat a little faster, but his voice remained steady. 15 years of courtroom experience had taught him how to keep his cool under pressure. He knew this moment could go one of two ways, and a lot depended on how he handled the next few minutes. "Officer, I don't mean any disrespect," the attorney said calmly, his hands still visible on the steering wheel, "but I have a right to know why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle. Could you please explain the reason for this stop?" His words were measured, professional, the same tone he used countless times in court. The officer's face tightened. "Listen here," he said, leaning closer to the window, his badge catching the glare of the streetlight. "When I give you an order, you follow it. Don't try to play lawyer with me." The irony of those words wasn't lost on the attorney, but he kept his expression neutral. More neighbors had gathered now, watching from their front yards. Someone was recording with their phone. The attorney could see the glow of their screen in his side mirror. He thought about all his clients who'd been in this exact situation, how many times he'd sat in his office listening to similar stories. Now he was living it firsthand. "Sir," the attorney began again, his voice clear and steady, "I understand you have a job to do. I respect that. But I also have rights under the law. You need reasonable suspicion to initiate a traffic stop, and I'm simply asking what that suspicion is." He could cite case law, mention Supreme Court decisions, but he knew that might only escalate things further. The officer's radio crackled with chatter. Another patrol car pulled up, making it 4 police vehicles now for what should have been a routine traffic stop. The attorney's dashboard camera kept recording, its small red light a silent witness to everything unfolding. "You're being uncooperative," the officer said, his voice rising slightly. "This could be considered obstruction." He tapped his flashlight against the car door, an unnecessary gesture that seemed designed to intimidate. But the attorney had seen these tactics before, from the other side of the courtroom. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the murmurs of the growing crowd of onlookers. The attorney thought about his family waiting at home, his daughter's soccer practice, the dinner getting cold. But he also thought about every client who'd sat across from him, describing moments just like this, moments where standing up for their rights had been twisted into obstruction. "Officer," he said, maintaining his composure, "I want to cooperate fully. But cooperation doesn't mean giving up our constitutional rights. I'm simply asking for the reason for this stop, as is my right under the law." His words were clear, each one carefully chosen from years of legal experience. The officer's radio crackled again. This time, he responded into it, speaking in low tones the attorney couldn't quite make out. More lights appeared in the distance, another patrol car approaching. The situation was escalating, but the attorney remained steady. He'd been here before, just never from this side. In the growing crowd, he could see his neighbor, a retired teacher, shaking his head in disbelief. A young couple he'd seen jogging past his house many times stood with their phones out, documenting everything. The attorney thought about how many times he used civilian recordings as evidence in court. Now those cameras were rolling for him. "Last chance," the officer said, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Show me your ID now, or you're going to have a problem." The threat was clear, but the attorney knew his rights. He'd spent his career defending those rights for others. He wouldn't, abandon them now. Taking a deep breath, he prepared his response. The words he was about to say weren't just for this moment. They were for every client he'd ever represented, every person who'd ever faced this situation without knowing their rights. His law degree caught the flashing lights as it hung from his rearview mirror, a reminder of why he'd chosen this path in the first place. The neighborhood had gone completely quiet now, save for the idle of engines and the occasional radio chatter. What happened next would either diffuse the situation or turn it into exactly the kind of case the attorney usually handled. Either way, he knew he had to stand his ground, not just for himself, but for everything he believed in as a civil rights attorney. The attorney took a deep breath, drawing on 15 years of courtroom experience. His voice remained calm and clear as he began to speak, each word carefully chosen. "Officer, I'd like to share something with you that might help us both." He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, the dashboard camera still faithfully recording every moment. The Supreme Court case Terry v. Ohio established that law enforcement needs reasonable suspicion for a traffic stop. He explained, his tone professional. This wasn't just about getting through a traffic stop anymore. It had become a moment of education, a real-world example of why knowing your rights matters. The attorney thought about how he would tell this story to his clients, how it would become another tool in helping them understand their own rights. The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, but the atmosphere had changed. What had started as tension had transformed into something like a community lesson in civil rights. Even the children in the upstairs window were still watching, witnesses to a moment they might remember for years to come. The moment of truth had arrived. The attorney reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and calm. "I'm going to show you my identification now," he announced clearly, maintaining the professional tone he used throughout the encounter. The officer's flashlight beam followed his hand movement, creating dancing shadows in the car's interior. First, he pulled out his driver's license, holding it up so it caught the light. But it was the second card he produced that changed everything: his Bar Association ID, complete with his photo and his title as a civil rights attorney. The gold embossing on the card caught the flashing police lights, making it seem to glow in the darkness. The change in the officer's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened slightly as he read the credentials, and his posture shifted from authoritative to uncertain in a matter of seconds. The flashlight beam wavered, then dropped. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire situation transformed. "You're the civil rights attorney?" the officer asked, his voice notably different from the commanding tone he'd used earlier. The attorney could see the mental calculations happening behind the officer's eyes as he presumably recalled news coverage of various police misconduct cases, wondering if he'd seen this attorney's name attached to any of them. A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. Someone whispered, "That's the lawyer from the news." The attorney noticed how the backup officers exchanged glances, their body language showing they recognized his name. He'd represented clients in some of the most high-profile civil rights cases in the state, and now here he was, experiencing firsthand what his clients had described countless times. The original officer's hand moved to his body camera, and the attorney noticed a telling detail. The small light that should have been blinking to indicate recording was dark. Had it been off this whole time? Or had it been turned off during the stop? Either way, it was another detail that would have been crucial in any legal case. Through his side mirror, the attorney could see more senior officers approaching from the backup vehicles. Their faces showed recognition. He'd seen some of them testify in court before. One of them, a sergeant he'd cross-examined just last month, was already pulling out his radio, presumably to call for guidance on how to handle this situation. The night air had grown cooler, but beads of sweat had formed on the original officer's forehead. The attorney thought about all his clients who'd sat in his office, describing similar moments of fear and uncertainty during traffic stops. The roles were reversed now, but the lesson was the same: knowledge of your rights was power. "I have to ask," the attorney said, still maintaining his professional tone, "why was I pulled over tonight? And why wasn't I given a reason when I first asked?" He kept his voice level, not accusatory, but firm. The questions hung in the air like the moisture from the officer's nervous breath in the cool night. The crowd had grown larger, with people from several houses down now watching the scene unfold. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of this unexpected turn of events. The attorney thought about how many times civilian recordings had made the difference in his cases, providing evidence that official cameras somehow missed. One of the senior officers stepped forward, his rank insignia catching the light. He was clearly trying to take control of the situation, to prevent it from becoming the kind of incident that might end up in a courtroom, the kind of courtroom where this attorney usually won. The original officer was now fumbling with his notepad, perhaps realizing that every moment of this stop would be scrutinized. The attorney could see his hands shaking slightly as he tried to write something down. It was a stark contrast to his aggressive confidence from just minutes earlier. The attorney glanced at his watch. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since he was first pulled over. His dinner was cold by now, his daughter's soccer practice missed. But something more important was happening here. This moment could be a catalyst for change, a real-world example of why civil rights matter. Through the windshield, he could see news vans pulling up at the end of the street. Word had gotten out somehow, perhaps from one of the neighbors' social media posts. The flashing lights of the police cars were about to be joined by the bright lights of news cameras, turning this quiet suburban street into the latest backdrop for a conversation about civil rights and law enforcement accountability. Instead of anger or resentment, the attorney saw an opportunity for something more valuable than a lawsuit. He looked at the officer, who was still visibly uncomfortable, and spoke in a tone that was both professional and understanding. "Let's talk about what happened here tonight and why it matters to everyone involved." The news vans had parked at a respectful distance, their cameras capturing the scene from afar. The attorney stepped out of his car now, his movements slow and deliberate. The crowd of neighbors had grown quiet, phones still recording, as he straightened his tie and prepared to turn this tense situation into a teaching moment. Every person who gets pulled over feels scared, he began, addressing not just the original officer, but all the law enforcement personnel present. I feel it too, even as a civil rights attorney. That fear is something we need to talk about as a community. His words carried across the quiet street, honest and direct without being confrontational. The senior officer who had stepped in earlier nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in these words. Behind him, several younger officers had moved closer to listen. The attorney noticed how some of them were taking notes, not for a report, but because they wanted to learn from this moment. When I asked for the reason for a stop, it's not about challenging authority, the attorney continued, gesturing to include everyone watching. It's about maintaining the trust between law enforcement and the community. Every person has rights, and every officer has responsibilities. When we understand both, we all benefit. He pulled out his phone, showing the dashboard camera footage he'd been recording. Technology isn't the enemy, he explained, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. It's a tool for accountability for both citizens and officers. When used properly, it protects everyone. Some of the officers exchanged glances, perhaps thinking about the body camera that had mysteriously stopped working. A cool breeze rustled through the trees as the attorney shared stories from his years of practice, not to shame anyone, but to help everyone understand. He talked about clients who had lost trust in the system, about officers who had learned to do better, about communities that had come together to create positive change. The law isn't just words in books, he said, pointing to his law degree still visible through the car window. It's a living thing that affects real people every day. When we ignore it, we hurt our community. When we respect it, we make our community stronger. The original officer, who had been quiet for a while, finally looked up and met his eyes. The news crews were inching closer that this wasn't about making headlines. The attorney spoke about training programs he helped develop, about departments that had transformed their approach to traffic stops, about the positive changes he'd seen when officers and communities worked together. What happened here tonight doesn't have to end in conflict, he explained, his voice carrying hope rather than accusation. It can be the beginning of something better. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out some materials about constitutional rights during traffic stops, resources he usually shared with his clients. The senior officer stepped forward, accepting the materials. "Maybe you could help us with our training program," he suggested, his voice sincere. Other officers nodded in agreement, recognizing that this encounter could lead to meaningful change rather than just another lawsuit. Parents in the crowd were explaining things to their children, turning this into a family learning moment. The attorney heard one mother telling her kids about knowing their rights and treating others with respect. These were the seeds of change being planted in the next generation. The original officer finally spoke up, his voice different now, humbler, more thoughtful. "I've never looked at it from this perspective before," he admitted. "We're taught to maintain control of the situation, but maybe there's a better way." His honesty seemed to encourage other officers to share their thoughts too. As the tension of the evening dissolved into productive discussion, the attorney noticed something remarkable. The barrier between us and them had started to fade. Officers and civilians were talking together, sharing perspectives, finding common ground in their shared humanity. The news vans were leaving now, perhaps disappointed that they hadn't captured a confrontation. But what they missed was more important, the quiet beginning of understanding, the small steps toward change that happen when people choose education over anger, progress over conflict. The weeks following that eventful traffic stop brought changes nobody had expected. Instead of filing a lawsuit, the attorney saw an opportunity to create lasting impact. He sat in his office one morning, looking at the pile of emails and phone messages from police departments across the state, all asking for his help in training their officers. The dashboard camera footage from that night had become a powerful teaching tool. In police academies and training sessions, officers would watch how a routine traffic stop transformed into a moment of understanding. They'd pause the video at key points, discussing what went right, what went wrong, and how to do better. "See, this is where communication broke down," the attorney would explain during training sessions, pointing to the screen. "And here's where it could have gone differently." Officers would lean forward in their seats, taking notes, asking questions. Some shared their own experiences, creating an open dialogue that hadn't existed before. The original officer from that night had become an unexpected ally in this mission for change. He'd volunteered to share his perspective during training sessions, standing before his fellow officers with honesty and humility. "I thought I was just following procedure," he'd tell them. "But that night taught me that procedure without understanding is just empty routine." The police department had taken a hard look at their traffic stop policies. They discovered that the officer's body camera hadn't been the only one with technical issues. There was a pattern that needed addressing. New guidelines were put in place, ensuring cameras stayed on, and officers clearly stated the reason for every stop. Community meetings started happening regularly at the local library. People would gather to learn about their rights, ask questions, and share concerns. The attorney noticed how the atmosphere in these meetings changed over time. What started as tension and mistrust slowly transformed into productive dialogue. One evening, the attorney received a call from a police academy instructor. "Your traffic stop video changed how we teach," the instructor said. "Now we focus on communication first, not just compliance." The attorney smiled, remembering how his daughter had asked him why he didn't seem angry about missing her soccer practice that night. The story had spread beyond their city. Other departments started reaching out, wanting to learn from what had happened. The attorney found himself traveling to different cities, sharing his experience from both sides of the law, as a civil rights lawyer and as someone who'd lived through a problematic traffic stop. Local schools asked him to speak to students about knowing their rights while respecting law enforcement. He'd look out at those young faces and see the next generation of both citizens and officers. Understanding each other doesn't mean giving up your rights or authority, he'd tell them. It means using them wisely. The dashboard camera footage had been viewed thousands of times in training sessions across the country. Each viewing sparked discussions, changed perspectives, and shaped new approaches to law enforcement. What could have been just another lawsuit had become a catalyst for real change. 6 months after the incident, the attorney sat in on a new officer training session. He watched as recruits role-played traffic stops, practicing clear communication and respect for civil rights. Their instructor, a veteran officer, emphasized the importance of explaining the reason for each stop right away. The police department's statistics told a story of progress. Complaints about traffic stops had dropped significantly. Body camera footage was consistently available for review. Officers were building trust with the community, one interaction at a time. Even the attorney's regular clients noticed the difference. Officers seemed different now, they'd tell him during consultations. They explained things better. They'd listen more. Each comment confirmed that small changes could have big impacts. A year later, the attorney parks his car in the same spot where he'd been pulled over that night. The street looked different in the daylight, peaceful and ordinary. A police car drove past and the officer waved, one of many who had been through the new training program. As he walked into his office that morning, the attorney saw a fresh stack of requests for training sessions on his desk. The incident that could have ended in anger and legal battle had instead sparked a movement for understanding and change. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, but it was progress, one traffic stop at a time.